Charleston, 1901. Behind the fading grandeur of the Bellamy Estate, a secret waited in silence. The heir to the family name, Thomas Bellamy, was hidden away, his story erased, his voice smothered, his truth buried beneath the very floorboards of his attic prison. Tonight, we unearth what the Bellamys tried to hide. If you care about the forgotten chapters of American history, like this video, share it, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so together we can give voice to the silenced dot at the dawn of the new century. Charleston stood like a city caught between two worlds. To the casual traveler arriving by train or carriage in 1901, it seemed timeless. Narrow cobblestone streets, lined with moss-draped oaks, iron gates guarding stately gardens, and church steeples piercing the sky as if they were pointing the way to heaven itself. The air was heavy with salt from the harbor, mingling with the fragrance of magnolia and the slow burn of coal fires. It was beautiful. It was old. And beneath its charm, it carried scars that still ached. The Civil War had ended almost 4 decades before, yet its shadow lingered over Charleston, like a cloud that refused to break. Many of the grand families who once flaunted their wealth in parlors and on piazzas had lost much of their fortune. Plantations had crumbled. Servants were fewer. Money was tighter. But Southern pride, was alive and fierce. Families clung to names, traditions, and appearances with desperate resolve. In this city, reputation mattered more than gold. The turn of the century brought whispers of progress, electric streetcars, the promise of industry, the hum of a modernizing America, but Charleston seemed hesitant, even resistant. Its people were rooted in the past, bound to a way of life that felt like a ghost of its former self. For the old families, preserving dignity was survival. To admit weakness, scandal, or shame was unthinkable. Better to bury secrets than allow the world to glimpse imperfection. And so, behind those beautiful gates and beneath the glow of gas lamps, countless stories went untold. Stories of loss, of sorrow, of hidden lives. Among them was the tragedy of the Bellamy Estate, a once proud home on the edge of town. From the street, it appeared much like the other's grand columns, weathered shutters, gardens that once bloomed in careful order. Yet the closer one looked, the more its decline showed. Vines overtaking bricks, wood rotting on window frames, and a silence about the place that unsettled even the neighbors. The Bellamys were known, respected, and feared in equal measure. Their fortune had dwindled since the war, but they maintained appearances with stern faces and carefully chosen words at church and society gatherings. To the public, they were dignified. But behind their doors, the Bellamy household carried a secret that, if revealed, would have shattered the fragile mask of respectability they wore. Charleston was a city where gossip moved like the tide, unavoidable, unstoppable, and often cruel. To have a son who did not reflect the strength and vigor of his lineage was to invite whispers, to invite pity, and in the eyes of many, to invite disgrace. For families like the Bellamys, reputation was not merely a matter of vanity. It was survival. Their name was currency. Their standing in the community ensured alliances, business dealings, and a place in a society still desperate to cling to order. And for that reason, they could not afford weakness. As church bells rang across the city and society ladies paraded their Sunday best along Meeting Street, no one outside the Bellamy gates could imagine the truth that waited within. Few suspected that in the shadowed rooms of that estate, an heir, their only son, was being quietly erased. His name rarely spoken, his face rarely seen, his life confined to an attic that would become both his refuge and his prison. Charleston in 1901 was a city of beauty and decay, of pride and secrecy. It was a city where appearances ruled, and where one family's determination to protect its image would condemn its most vulnerable member to silence. And it is within this world this delicate balance of honor and shame that the story of Thomas Bellamy begins. At the dawn of the new century, Charleston stood like a city caught between two worlds. To the casual traveler arriving by train or carriage in 1901, it seemed timeless. Narrow cobblestone streets, lined with moss-draped oaks, iron gates guarding stately gardens, and church steeples piercing the sky as if they were pointing the way to heaven itself. The air was heavy with salt from the harbor, mingling with the fragrance of magnolia and the slow burn of coal fires. It was beautiful. It was old. And beneath its charm, it carried scars that still ached. The Civil War had ended almost 4 decades before, yet its shadow lingered over Charleston, like a cloud that refused to break. Many of the grand families who once flaunted their wealth in parlors and on piazzas had lost much of their fortune. Plantations had crumbled. Servants were fewer. Money was tighter. But Southern pride, was alive and fierce. Families clung to names, traditions, and appearances with desperate resolve. In this city, reputation mattered more than gold. The turn of the century brought whispers of progress, electric streetcars, the promise of industry, the hum of a modernizing America, but Charleston seemed hesitant, even resistant. Its people were rooted in the past, bound to a way of life that felt like a ghost of its former self. For the old families, preserving dignity was survival. To admit weakness, scandal, or shame was unthinkable. Better to bury secrets than allow the world to glimpse imperfection. And so, behind those beautiful gates and beneath the glow of gas lamps, countless stories went untold. Stories of loss, of sorrow, of hidden lives. Among them was the tragedy of the Bellamy Estate, a once proud home on the edge of town. From the street, it appeared much like the other's grand columns, weathered shutters, gardens that once bloomed in careful order. Yet the closer one looked, the more its decline showed. Vines overtaking bricks, wood rotting on window frames, and a silence about the place that unsettled even the neighbors. The Bellamys were known, respected, and feared in equal measure. Their fortune had dwindled since the war, but they maintained appearances with stern faces and carefully chosen words at church and society gatherings. To the public, they were dignified. But behind their doors, the Bellamy household carried a secret that, if revealed, would have shattered the fragile mask of respectability they wore. Charleston was a city where gossip moved like the tide, unavoidable, unstoppable, and often cruel. To have a son who did not reflect the strength and vigor of his lineage was to invite whispers, to invite pity, and in the eyes of many, to invite disgrace. For families like the Bellamys, reputation was not merely a matter of vanity. It was survival. Their name was currency. Their standing in the community ensured alliances, business dealings, and a place in a society still desperate to cling to order. And for that reason, they could not afford weakness. As church bells rang across the city and society ladies paraded their Sunday best along Meeting Street, no one outside the Bellamy gates could imagine the truth that waited within. Few suspected that in the shadowed rooms of that estate, an heir, their only son, was being quietly erased. His name rarely spoken, his face rarely seen, his life confined to an attic that would become both his refuge and his prison. Charleston in 1901 was a city of beauty and decay, of pride and secrecy. It was a city where appearances ruled, and where one family's determination to protect its image would condemn its most vulnerable member to silence. And it is within this world, this delicate balance of honor and shame, that the story of Thomas Bellamy begins. Thomas Bellamy entered the world on a humid summer night in 1884, when the cicadas sang from the trees and thunder rolled distantly over the harbor. The midwife whispered that the child seemed delicate, his cries thin and weak compared to the lusty wails of other newborns. Eleanor, exhausted yet radiant, clutched him to her chest and prayed silently that strength would come with time. But from the very beginning, it was clear that Thomas was not like other boys. As an infant, he struggled to feed. His little chest rose and fell too quickly. His breath often rattled, and sickness clung to him like a shadow. Neighbors who came calling noticed the pale infant kept swaddled in blankets, his large eyes peering out with an almost ghostly solemnity. They whispered their concern in hushed tones once they returned home, careful not to speak too loudly in case word reached the Bellamy. By the time Thomas reached his early years, his body remained fragile. His bones seemed too thin for his frame, and he tired easily from the simplest activities. While other children ran through Charleston streets, laughing and kicking up dust, Thomas watched from a window, his hand pressed to the glass. Sometimes, when no one was looking, he scribbled small figures of the children in a notebook, trying to capture the joy he longed to share. Inside the Bellamy household, he was both loved and hidden. His mother, Eleanor, tended to him with quiet devotion. She read aloud from the Bible and from books of poetry, her voice filling the room as Thomas lay wrapped in quilts. At night, she would sit at his bedside and stroke his hair, whispering that he was her special boy. In those private moments, she allowed herself to weep. For Eleanor knew the truth. Society would never accept her son as he was. Charles Bellamy, however, viewed his son differently. To him, Thomas was both a sorrow and an inconvenience. A sickly heir threatened the family's standing, and Charles's pride could not bear the weight of pity. Though he did not strike or curse the boy, his presence around Thomas was distant, cold, perfunctory. He spoke to him rarely, and when he did, his words carried the heaviness of disappointment. For a man like Charles, whose life had been shaped by rigid codes of honor, a frail son was a kind of personal failure. Yet Thomas was not without spirit. His frailty sharpened his mind, and his hours of solitude filled him with imagination. He loved to read stories of knights, explorers, and adventurers who roamed the world boldly, defying odds and claiming glory. He copied passages into his journal and dreamed of places beyond the dusty shutters of the Bellamy Estate. His drawings, though childlike, revealed a restless heart. Ships at sea, towering castles, bustling cities he had never seen. In his words and sketches, he carved out a life denied to his body. But as he grew older, the gap between Thomas and the world outside widened. By his teenage years, his appearance had become unsettling to those who glimpsed him. His face was thin, his skin almost translucent in the dim light, and his eyes carried a haunted depth that unnerved visitors. Some whispered of consumption, others of a family curse. Servants avoided his gaze, speaking of him only when necessary. To them, he was not cruel, but he was a reminder of something unnatural, something the family seemed desperate to deny at social gatherings. Eleanor and Charles never mentioned their son. Invitations to other homes were accepted without him. Explanations deflected with a curt, "Thomas is unwell." In time, many Charleston neighbors forgot there even was an heir. The Bellamys presented themselves as a family of two, and the city allowed the silence to stand. For Thomas, the isolation was a slow breaking of the spirit. He felt himself fading, not only in body but in memory. He once overheard a servant tell a delivery man, "The Bellamys have no children." That night, he wrote in his journal with a trembling hand, "If they do not speak of me, do I exist?" This question would haunt him for years. It was not death he feared most, it was erasure. To be born into a family with a name carved into Charleston's history, yet to be left without a trace, seemed a fate more cruel than the illness that weakened his bones. And so, as the years passed, Thomas withdrew further into his attic refuge, where his words and drawings became the only proof of his existence. To the world, the Bellamys remained a proud family clinging to their fading grandeur. But within the shadowed corners of their home, their fragile, withered heir was already slipping into silence. The attic of the Bellamy Estate was never meant for living. It was a place for storage old trunks, moth-eaten clothes, boxes of yellowed letters, furniture too worn for the parlor, but too sentimental to throw away. Yet for Thomas, this shadowed room beneath the slanted roof became both a sanctuary and a cell. The stairs leading to the attic were narrow and creaked beneath every step, a reminder of the isolation that awaited at the top. Light entered through a single warped window, where dust floated endlessly in the shafts of sun. In summer, the air grew stifling, heavy with heat. In winter, the cold cut through the boards and left him shivering beneath thin quilts. The smells of the space-old wood, mildew, candle smoke became as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. His bed was a narrow iron frame pushed against the wall, its mattress thin and lumpy. Beside it sat a wooden crate that served as his table, covered with scraps of paper, ink bottles, and stubby pencils worn down from use. Against another wall, he kept stacks of books, some gifted by his mother, others salvaged from forgotten corners of the house. Each one was read and reread until the words became part of him. Here, in this forgotten space, Thomas created his own world. He wrote endlessly journal entries, sketches, fragments of poems. His handwriting, delicate at first, grew cramped and shaky over the years, as though the weight of silence pressed itself into every line. He wrote of the world outside, the sounds of carriage wheels on Meeting Street, the scent of salt carried in from the harbor, the laughter of children he could only imagine. He wrote of freedom, of walking without weakness, of breathing air without pain. When he tired of writing, he drew. The pages bore images of ships with towering masts, of mountains crowned with snow, of cities alive with lights and noise. Yet alongside these dreams, darker sketches emerged. A figure crouched in a corner, eyes hollow. A door locked with heavy chains. A bird with broken wings. In these drawings, Thomas revealed the truth he could not say aloud. The attic also bore witness to his small rebellions. Some nights, when the house grew quiet, Thomas would push the window open and let the humid Charleston air rush in. He would stretch his thin arms toward the stars and whisper to the night as though someone might answer. He sometimes tied scraps of paper to bits of string, lowering them out the window in the hope that a passerby might find them. Most were torn away by the wind, but the act itself gave him comfort proof that he was still reaching outward, still refusing to be erased. The servants knew of his presence, of course. A few pitied him quietly, slipping him extra bread or a blanket during cold months. But even they were bound by the family silence. One maid, years later, recalled how Thomas would thank her with a smile that seemed to carry both gratitude and sorrow. She confessed it was like he knew he wasn't meant to exist. And yet he was so gentle, so alive. For Eleanor, the attic became a place of anguish. She visited often, reading to him, bringing him food, smoothing his hair with trembling hands. But even her love could not erase the sense of shame that weighed upon her. When she left, she locked the door, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of what others might say if they saw him. Each turn of the key was a wound on her heart, yet she did it all the same. For Charles, the attic was an embarrassment best ignored. He seldom climbed the stairs. On rare occasions, when he did, his presence filled the room with coldness. He would stand at the window, his son's figure reflected faintly in the glass beside him, and speak of nothing at all. When he left, his footsteps down the stairs carried relief to return to a world where his son's frailty did not exist. Years passed this way. Seasons turned, the city outside changed, and still Thomas remained in his attic world. His body weakened further, but his mind burned bright with longing. In one journal entry, he wrote, "I have traveled farther in these pages than most men do with their feet. But still, I would give all the words in me to walk down King Street just once, To breathe as they breathe, to laugh as they laugh, the attic was both cradle and coffin. It sheltered him, gave him space to dream, yet it confined him to a silence that grew heavier with time. Every beam, every creaking board seemed to hold his sorrow. And though no one in Charleston spoke his name, within those walls his spirit raged against the erasure forced upon him. In the end, the attic did what the world would not. It remembered him. Every scrap of paper, every mark of pencil, every line of ink was a cry against forgetting. For Thomas Bellamy, life in the attic was not just existence, it was resistance. In Charleston, appearances were not simply important, they were everything. A family's reputation was its lifeblood, the invisible currency that opened doors and secured alliances. To fall from grace was to lose far more than status. It was to lose one's place in the world entirely. For the Bellamys, whose fortune had dwindled since the war, the preservation of dignity became an obsession. And in their minds, Thomas threatened all of it. At first, they tried subtlety. When he was still a child, invitations were politely declined. The excuse was always the same. Thomas is unwell. Guests assumed it meant a passing fever, a common childhood ailment, nothing more. But as months turned into years, and Thomas was never seen at church or in the company of other boys his age, whispers began to stir. Charleston was a city of gossip. Words floated like pollen on the breeze, settling in parlors and over tea tables. Neighbors wondered aloud, why was the Bellamy boy kept hidden? Some claimed he had been sent away to school. Others insisted he had died young, the tragedy too painful to speak of. A few speculated darker reasons: madness, deformity, or a family curse. In time, curiosity gave way to silence. The Bellamys had made their wishes clear. Thomas was not to be spoken of. Inside the estate, that silence was law. Servants were instructed never to mention him beyond the walls of the house. If questioned, they were to respond firmly. The Bellamys have no son. Many obeyed out of loyalty, others out of fear. For to defy Charles Bellamy's stern authority was unthinkable. Eleanor bore the silence most painfully. In her heart, she longed to tell the world of her son's gentle spirit, of his poetry and drawings, of the wisdom he carried despite his frail body. Yet each time she looked into the eyes of Charleston society women measuring eyes, quick to judge her words withered on her tongue. To confess her son's condition would invite pity, and pity, in Charleston, was as cutting as scorn. Charles, however, felt no such conflict. To him, silence was protection. He believed that by erasing Thomas from conversation, he was shielding the family name from ruin. He told himself that it was mercy, not to Thomas, but to the Bellamys who would come after. For Charles could not imagine that the boy's writings, his small rebellions, his yearning for recognition, mattered compared to the weight of a surname carved into Charleston's history. The longer Thomas was hidden, the easier the silence became. It was as though the family convinced themselves he was not there. At dinner parties, Charles and Eleanor would sit across from guests, discussing weather, politics, and society news, never once betraying that, only a floor above them. Their son listened to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses, his heart aching for inclusion. For Thomas, the silence was more suffocating than the attic walls. It was one thing to be frail, to be bound to a small room. It was another to feel erased, to know that his very existence was denied. On one page of his journal, he wrote in unsteady lines, "I hear them laugh below. They speak as though I am nothing. Perhaps I am. Perhaps silence has made me nothing." The cruelest part of this silence was not that strangers forgot him. It was that his own bloodline chose to erase him. In Charleston's rigid code of honor, Thomas became a casualty, sacrificed not to death alone, but to the hunger for reputation. And so, as the years passed, the Bellamys perfected their act. To the city, they were a dignified, if dwindling, family. To themselves, they were guardians of a name too fragile to bear imperfection. And for Thomas, the attic grew heavier with each unspoken word, each Sunday service where his parents bowed their heads as though he had never been born. The silence did what illness could not. It hollowed him. It stripped him of presence. It carved his absence into history. And in Charleston, where legacy meant everything, Thomas Bellamy became what his family demanded, an heir not of flesh and spirit, but of silence. Years passed, and the Bellamy Estate, like its family, began to crumble. The walls that once held the weight of wealth and pride grew thin with age. Paint peeled, shutters hung crooked, and the gardens, once meticulously planned, became overrun with weeds. Charleston society slowly forgot the Bellamys entirely, their grand name fading like the carved initials on the estate's gates, not by the early 1920s. The house had been sold to a distant relative who rarely visited. Laborers were hired to restore parts of the estate, patching the roof, reinforcing staircases, and cleaning rooms left untouched for decades. No one expected to find much, just dust, old furniture, and the remnants of a family long gone from memory. Yet the attic, long sealed and avoided, held secrets no one could imagine. It was Thomas's journal that first drew attention. Hidden beneath floorboards that had warped with age, the bundles of brittle paper lay like a forgotten tomb. A workman's hammer had loosened one of the boards while fixing the stairs, revealing a small cavity, just wide enough to slip his hand inside. There, wrapped in layers of faded cloth, were notebooks, sketches, and letters. The handwriting was delicate, the ink faded, but still legible. As the laborer unfolded the pages, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the attic itself remembered the boy who had spent years in silence. There were drawings of the city as Thomas imagined it, the bustling streets, the distant harbor, ships with towering sails, and even scenes of the house from above, where he had traced the rooms he had never been allowed to leave. Among the sketches were the darker ones, the thin figure, crouched in a corner, a door with chains, a bird with broken wings. Even without understanding the story behind them, the images spoke of confinement, of longing, and of sorrow. But it was the journals that told the most. Thomas wrote of the world outside his attic, of dreams he could never live, and of the family that had erased him from history. One entry stopped the workers cold. "They have forgotten me. But I am still here, in the corners, in the dust, in the walls they cannot see. One day someone may find these words, and I will breathe again." The words were simple, yet piercing. It was not illness alone that had marked Thomas's life, but neglect and the deliberate silence of those who should have loved him most. Each page was a testament to a boy who had lived fully in his imagination while the world outside ignored his existence. The discovery shook the small team working in the attic. No one spoke of ghosts, though a chill seemed to hang heavier than the summer air. They carefully collected each item, preserving the fragile documents in boxes. Historians who later examined the materials marveled at their depth. A life hidden for decades, recorded meticulously by a child's hand, and preserved against erasure. It was in these pages that Thomas became more than a footnote. He was a boy with thoughts, dreams, fears, and hopes, a human being denied acknowledgement. Scholars later noted the clarity and poignancy of his reflections. He understood his isolation, the cruelty of silence, yet he held on to hope that someone, someday, might read his words and remember. The attic itself, long forgotten and feared, had become a sanctuary and a final witness. The hidden journals confirmed what some had long suspected but could never prove, that the Bellamy heir had lived and suffered, and that his story had been deliberately hidden by a family, desperate to protect its image. The discovery beneath the floorboards transformed the estate from a relic of fading wealth into a silent monument to a forgotten life. It was a reminder that even in places where history seems preserved, countless stories lie buried, waiting for someone to uncover them. And in Charleston, beneath the warped floorboards of the Bellamy attic, Thomas Bellamy finally spoke again, decades after the world had forgotten him. Thomas Bellamy's life ended quietly, as it had been lived, without fanfare, without witness, and almost entirely unrecorded. By the time his body grew too frail to withstand even minor illness, the Bellamy Estate was still standing, but the world beyond its walls had largely moved on. No neighbors came to inquire about the boy who had become a young man. No friends knocked at the door. To Charleston society, Thomas had never existed. The day of his death was as muted as the life he had led. Eleanor, now older and more frail herself, sat by his side, clutching his hand as his breathing slowed. Charles had retreated to the parlor, pretending that grief could be managed from a distance, as though avoidance could contain it. There were no funeral invitations, no church announcements, no crowd to mourn. Only a small group of loyal servants, who had watched Thomas grow and suffered in silence alongside him, were present to carry out what little arrangements could be made. He was buried on family land, in a corner of the estate that had once been a garden. No headstone marked his resting place, no marble etched with his name. To the world, it was as if he had never drawn a breath. Even the official records, church registries, city death logs, and census forms omitted him entirely. Thomas Bellamy had been erased, not only from society, but from history itself. Yet in the quiet corners of the estate, his life had left an imprint. The attic, the journals, the sketches, they remained. Every mark of pencil and ink testified that he had lived, dreamed, and suffered. Though the Bellamys sought to protect their image, they could not protect the truth from persistence. Paper endures. Walls remember. Silence cannot erase a story written with care, with heart, with soul. Over time, the estate decayed further. Charles and Eleanor passed away, leaving no one to maintain the house. The land, the trees, the floors, and the walls became vessels for memory that no one acknowledged. Yet beneath the attic floorboards, Thomas's words waited patiently, like seeds buried in soil, ready to sprout for anyone willing to uncover them. It was a cruel irony. The Bellamys had sought to protect their reputation, but in doing so, they had created a secret that would outlive them. Thomas, erased from official accounts, became immortal in his hidden legacy. The journals revealed a human being of depth and sensitivity, a life that mattered, even if society refused to see it. His voice, long silenced in life, would speak loudly for future generations willing to listen. Historians who later discovered his writings marveled at the emotional clarity, the insight, and the resilience captured in the pages. They noted how Thomas had endured not only illness but neglect, and how he had turned confinement into creation. In death, as in life, he remained an observer, chronicling his world in the quietest, most deliberate way. The Bellamy's name survived, tied to old Charleston prestige. But Thomas's story, once unearthed, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that history is often written by the living, and that those who are forgotten may still leave traces. The boy whose life was hidden beneath floorboards had left evidence of a soul who yearned, who imagined, and who persisted against erasure. And so, though the city never knew of his existence during his lifetime, Thomas Bellamy's life could no longer be ignored. The secret buried beneath the estate was uncovered, giving him a posthumous presence far more enduring than the fleeting recognition the Bellamys once craved. As we step back from the Bellamy Estate and the life of Thomas Bellamy, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what was lost and what was hidden. His story is more than the tale of a frail heir trapped in an attic. It is a reminder of how easily lives can be erased when reputation is valued above compassion, and appearances are deemed more important than truth. History often celebrates the visible, the powerful, the successful. But for every figure remembered in books or on plaques, Countless others are forgotten, their voices silenced, their experiences buried under the weight of societal expectation. Thomas Bellamy is one such life, a boy whose heart burned with creativity, whose mind soared beyond the walls that confined him, yet whose family chose silence over acknowledgement. Imagine for a moment the loneliness he endured. Years of watching life pass by, hearing laughter from the streets below, knowing he was barred from participating. Imagine the courage it took to continue dreaming, to write, to draw, to insist in every small way that he existed, even when the world acted as if he did not. In that attic, in those journals, he carved out a place for himself that no one could erase. And this is where we, as witnesses centuries later, come to hold the story. To remember Thomas Bellamy is to honor not only his life, but the countless others who are quietly lost to history. It is to recognize the human cost of pride, the pain of silence, and the quiet strength of a soul that refuses to vanish entirely. His life asks us to consider our own priorities. What do we choose to remember, and what do we allow to be forgotten? How many voices, like Thomas's, are waiting for someone to notice, to care, to give them acknowledgement long denied? History is not only the story of those in the public eye. It is also the story of those hidden behind closed doors, whose lives, if remembered, reveal the fullness of the past. So, when we look back at Charleston, at the faded grandeur of estates like the Bellamy House, we must look deeper. Beyond the walls, beyond the gardens and gates, lies the truth of lives lived in silence, lives that matter even when official records say otherwise. Thomas Bellamy's story reminds us, to know history fully, we must listen for the quiet voices, the erased names, the stories waiting beneath the floorboards. The Bellamy Estate stands still today, a weathered reminder of Charleston's past. Its columns lean slightly, paint peels from the shutters, and the gardens have surrendered to time. Passers-by may admire its architecture or wonder at its history, but few know of the boy who lived and suffered within its walls. Few know of Thomas Bellamy, the withered heir, whose life was erased from records and memory. Yet, for those who dare to look closer, his presence remains. In the attic, where light struggles through warped windows, in the fragile journals and sketches hidden beneath floorboards, Thomas speaks across time. His words are a testament to resilience, to the human spirit that refuses to vanish even when silenced. Every line, every drawing, every whispered hope in ink is a defiance against the erasure he endured. It is a haunting truth. Thomas was denied the life he longed for, denied the recognition every child deserves, and yet he left a legacy that no amount of silence could erase. The Bellamy family may have sought to protect their reputation, but in doing so, they preserved the very mystery that allows Thomas's story to reach us now. What they feared others would forget, time and persistence have revealed. As we reflect on this story, it asks us to consider the lives that lie hidden in the shadows of history. How many voices have been silenced, not by fate, but by the rigid walls of pride and societal expectation? How many dreams have gone unnoticed because the world was unwilling to see weakness, illness, or difference? History is incomplete without these quiet stories, and it is our responsibility to remember them, to give them life again through acknowledgement. So when you think of the Bellamy Estate, or of any forgotten corner of history, remember Thomas. Listen for the whispers in the attic, for the stories beneath the floorboards. Let his life remind us that every existence matters, even those deemed unworthy of notice. If this story moved you, help us honor the forgotten by liking this video, sharing it with friends, and subscribing to our channel. Together, we can uncover more lost chapters of American history, giving voice to those who were silenced and ensuring their memories endure.